I really like your phrasing of carving the deep facade, sort of trying to create depth. And I guess it is often within this depth that you can sort of linger on your way in and out, and that quality of sort of being in between is often the space where you might meet someone. And I think that there are particular devices like with your inset doors there, which I think are really successful. And I guess sort of inversely, the sort of bay window is also an interesting one, because it actually brings the house out, the sort of domestic interior slightly out onto the street, and helps with that you were talking about, that idea of sort of surveillance and feeling.
Yeah, I'm really intrigued by bay windows. I mean, there's a huge, brilliant of history of these sort of domestic details in British architecture. You can look back at, well, Victorians or Edwardian housing has those lovely moments that are sort of outside effectively kind of outside the envelope of the home, but provide that transition. And they're curious. I think, I mean, it's interesting with this view of Stephen Taylor's, you've got the taller bay at the end where the window faces down the street. And the beautiful thing about bay windows is that you can stand in the bay and look across, but also up and down the street. But then as soon as you step back behind what's effectively the main wall line, you have a sense of privacy. And John Soane was the expert at this. I mean, his house in Lincoln's Inn Field, I think, is one of the most magical, has one of the most magical facades, because it's effectively a Georgian terrace, but then he's added this extra layer, this very deep layer of bay windows on the outside, which when you're in the yellow drawing room, you get a sense of the city beyond, but then you can move across between the columns into that bay and feel more fully engaged with the city. So they're really lovely moments to design, and I think they're very, I don't know if they're peculiarly British, but I think we do them very well. And the other thing I really appeals to me in these sort of domestic details is when they're thought about as a whole. So if you look at certain Victorian houses or even Norman Shaw houses, sometimes he'll combine the bay window with the porch with a balcony. So the roof of the bay window is a small balcony for plants at first floor. But then it carries on across beyond the bay and provides shelter at the front door. And so one element is providing three tasks, and it's something we explored on our retrofit scheme in Hillington Square, where we added these sort of bolt-on bays to the front of the building. It was a 1960s estate, and those bays worked really hard. They were a new entrance for the ground floor dwellings, which were in a converted garage, or rather extended the space of an existing dwelling into the garage. They provided a bay window at first floor, they provided storage at second floor and a balcony at third floor. And so these sort of devices can work very hard. Often they're seen as unnecessary additional cost, but they have many benefits.
These were just some other examples of, either defensible space, but also kind of shifting heights of windows in relation to street, and how that can be something which both has a relationship to the street, but also creates a space of a different kind inside, and how the kind of composition of that can be quite key in addressing this sort of private space, domestic space, which has a relation to the street and the kind of common ground beyond.
And I think there's another side aspect to it, which is, as well as the sort of quality it gives internally, it's as much about the decorum it offers the public realm. So for me, this example is very much about using the bay and the darker brick. It's a means of grounding the building. And I think with domestic architecture, and especially when you get to apartment buildings, the ground floor and then the roof line are really key areas of interest to me. How it sits on the ground, how you feel that sense of connection. I mean, it's interesting in this example that it's actually back of pavement. So there isn't any threshold between the two examples that you started of ours, where you have a small private garden, landscape garden, that stops people wandering right up to the window. And I mentioned in my introduction that the sort of Dutch sense of privacy is more relaxed, and buildings can sit back of pavement, but that doesn't mean that they don't enjoy these sort of details that provide depth to the facade, but also help ground it and give it a plinth that differentiates it from the upper levels.
It's interesting what you're saying about the immediacy of some of those Dutch examples, of being able to still kind of have that privacy and that the depth within a very, very thin skin. Whereas I guess it starts to become much easier, well, not easier, but you're working in a different way with sort of a bit of landscaping or so on.
Well, it's interesting, the other aspect to a lot of these examples is that to rightly deal with accessibility, now your ground floor is at grade. It's the same level as the pavement. Whereas Georgian terraces quite often were elevated up half a level. Now that was partly expedient because they were digging down half a level to excavate the clay for the brick, but also it had an interesting spatial consequence, because by elevating the ground floor up a few steps, it means that if you're walking along the street and you're looking in, your eye line is up to the ceiling, which is why there were kind of beautiful roses around the ceiling light, or architraves around the edges of the room, because your eye is taken to the ceiling. But then if you're inside, you're looking out across the heads of people on the street. So again, you have a sense of privacy. Now with contemporary domestic architecture, the ease with which we can create that difference is gone, because we're much more conscientious about trying to make homes more accessible for those who have particular needs. So then you have to find other techniques for providing that privacy. And this example is quite interesting, because you realise that actually also you have all that paraphernalia that we have to cater for today. That again, different countries will deal with it differently, but in a lot of the schemes we're working on, as soon as you do a house or a duplex or a maisonette at ground floor, the authority expect bins to be catered for on a one-to-one basis, i.e. each house has to have its bin store. Whereas with apartments, it will be a communal refuse store. But in this example, that bin store actually again helps provide that depth between the street and the front door. And I mean, to some extent, it's unfortunate architecture that we have to cater for. But if it can be done well, then perhaps it has further benefits. You know, this example is not just providing a deep threshold, but actually it's providing a bit of a screening between each of the terrace houses. There's also something about the ecology, isn't there? The advantage of us being, of our cultural kind of preference for that front garden, is that we can green the city and enrich the biodiversity and the ecology of the city and the street.